Okay, so I'm going to start with where I left off last time, with what I was calling the four basic steps of Hume's skeptical argument in section 4. Um, so fortunately, I already have the first step still written up here. Um, and I guess, so I should say, I mean, the conclusion of this argument is going to be a doubt, and it's going to be a doubt whether we should uh, um, believe anything about matters of fact beyond the immediate evidence of our senses and our memory. That's the conclusion. Um, uh, so the first step is to point out that our belief in matters of fact beyond the immediate evidence of our senses and our memory um, is always an inference from effect to cause. Um, and Right, I explained that by saying, as I think Hume explains it, by saying that the way it's an inference from effect to cause is that some, we receive some impression of the senses, or we remember having received one. We infer from that to its cause, and then we infer from its cause to some other effect, some collateral effect, as they say. So, like, for example, we see a flame. That is, we see that visible shape and color and motion. Um, we infer from that that there's something there that causes those things. Um, Somehow we get from that to that thing will also cause something else, namely heat. And therefore, we conclude that, and see, this is beyond the immediate evidence of my senses. I'm seeing the fire now, but I'm not feeling it yet. But I conclude that if I get closer to it, I will feel heat. So it's really an inference from effect to cause and back to another effect. Um, at least this is the way we think of it, as long as we believe in a distinction between the immediate objects of our thought and their external causes. Um, we'll see in the treatise that Hume argues that most of the time when we're not thinking about it, we don't believe in these external causes. So, in other words, basically, he agrees with Berkeley about this. Most of the time when we're not thinking about it, we think of these as the things the things we're immediately conscious of as the things themselves. And so in that case, we're thinking of A as the cause and B as the effect, and this is really an inference from cause to effect. But Hume also will argue in the treatise that this view, Berkeley's view, won't stand up to philosophical reflection. So as soon as we start thinking about it, we're drawn back into this view. And we'll see how that works out. Then this view turns out not to make sense either. But so in any case, sometimes Hume in the first Enquiry talks as if our ideas themselves were cause and effect, and this were the cause-effect relation. But most of the time, he takes the philosophical view, as he's going to call it in the treatise, and distinguishes between the causes of our impressions and the impressions themselves. And that's what he's thinking when he says this is always an inference from effect to cause. All right, so it's always an inference from effect to cause. Step 2, this assumes a necessary connection. It assumes actually a necessary connection, at least again on the philosophical way of thinking about it. The necessary connection it assumes is in the external object, right? That is, it's this line I drew here between this being the cause of A and this being the cause of B. We assume that whatever is the cause of A will always also be the cause of B. Or rather, I mean, in order to make this inference make sense, we must assume that we know something like this, right? Otherwise, from the fact that I feel, I mean, that I see that visible appearance of fire right now, I can infer that the cause of that is here, the cause of the visible appearance of fire. That, again, is the immediate evidence of sense, which we're not calling into question here. But I can't get from that to anything else, like that thing that's there will also cause heat if I get close to it. For that, I need to assume I know some necessary connection in the cause. So this always assumes a necessary connection in the cause. And then the third step is we learn about such connections only by experience. We learn about such connections only by experience. So that is, there's never a contradiction. This is the way Hume understands this. There's never a contradiction involved in thinking that something could be the cause of A, but not also the cause of B. Right? So there's no contradiction in imagining something that causes the visible appearance of fire, but not the heat. If it's true that nothing ever causes that visible appearance without also causing the heat, yeah, I mean, I guess that's not true, right? Because you can see like a fire in a mirror or something, and that has the visible appearance. But I don't know if seeing something in the mirror counts as the. Well, anyway, be that as it may. But assume, according to assume we think that this inference is really solid. We must think that we know that the cause of A is always also cause of B. And Hume says, but since there's never a contradiction in something being the cause of A but not B, we couldn't have learned that by demonstration. So how could we have learned it? We must have learned it from experience. Now, I mean, so far, I want to point out, I mean, you might think we've reached the skeptical conclusion already here, right? Because then you would say, well, but, experience only gives probability, something like that. But, I mean, you can make this part of the argument with probability too, and you can say, well, Um, we've mostly seen that what makes this visible appearance is accompanied by heat. How did we learn that? We learned it from experience. So then you can conclude, as Locke does, that most, at least, of our, Hume will change most to all, which is maybe going to cause some problems on its own. But anyway, that most of what we call knowledge of matters of fact outside of our immediate um, sensation and memory, that most of what we call knowledge of matters of fact is really just opinion, or what Locke calls judgment, but it's very probable opinion. So, I'm very justified in thinking that this thing will also feel hot if I get close to it. So that wouldn't really, I mean, that does point to a doubt. I'm not 100% certain, but it doesn't really point to a skeptical doubt. It doesn't tend to undermine my whole knowledge of the world. It just tells me, be careful, don't be absolutely certain. Okay, we knew that. But it's the last step. So the last step says, um, by the way, I guess before I go on to the last step, maybe I should ask this question. I talked about this a little bit last time. Yeah, actually, I think I talked about this last time. Right? How is it that we know that there can't be a contradiction between being the cause of A and not being the cause of B? It's because Hume maintains against Locke that there's never a visible necessary connection between distinct ideas. Um, uh, and I think I was claiming last time that um, um, that has something to do with the fact that impressions are not only stronger than ideas, but are also simple. Um, so, Locke agrees that they're simple, but Locke also thinks that some simple ideas can have a necessary connection to another, and I think Berkeley and Hume both think that doesn't make sense. If it's simple, how can it point to something else? Right? It's simple. It means it's self-sufficient. It doesn't have like a kind of empty place in it that needs to be filled in by something else or something like that. Um, so uh, so I think Hume thinks that um, this part we know by the relations of ideas. That is, we know for sure that distinct ideas can't have necessary connections between them, and therefore we can't know about necessary connections in their causes the way Locke thinks we can. Okay, but then the last step is saying what experience can't give us a reason to believe in such a connection. Um, so that is, by give us a reason, I mean it can't, as Hume says, it's not an operation of our reason by which we conclude from experience that we can draw this inference, that there is this necessary connection, and therefore we can draw this inference. So, I mean, the main argument about this is on page 21 of part 4. I mean, it's in section 4. It's on page 21. That's not wrong. Wait, that's just this. Okay, that's not actually the argument. That's just the statement of the conclusion itself. Even after we have experience of the operations of cause and effect, our conclusions from that experience are not founded on reasoning or on any process of the understanding. Oh, okay, right. Okay, I remember what I was going to say. This is kind of tricky, but it's clever. So he says, right, if this gave us a reason, that would mean that we know for sure that every time something happens over and over again, it will continue to happen forever. Or you could even say we know for sure that every time something mostly happens over and over again, it's very likely it will continue to happen forever, right? In other words, again, we could reduce our standards and only call for probability here rather than certainty, and his argument is still going to show a problem. So the question is, so that means we're applying a principle when we make this conclusion, and the principle is, I mean, he sums it up by saying the future will be like the past, right? That's the principle that we're applying here in order to learn from experience. We see something happen over and over, we apply our principle, the future will be like the past, and we conclude that this thing will continue to happen. But the problem is that that principle itself is about a necessary connection between matters of fact, right? That is, that principle itself says something about the cause of our impressions. It says that, you know, when it causes the same thing over and over, it also will be the cause of the same thing happening in the future. So the principle itself is one of these connections. So how do we know that principle? Now, I mean, this is what's sometimes called the problem of induction. I think, I'm not even sure if that's the best way to think about it, but without bringing into, you know, defining induction and everything, I think you can understand we're trying to find a necessary connection just like this, or we're assuming it in order to make all of these inferences. So where did we get it? Well, so by point 3 itself, we can't have demonstrated it, right? Because point 3 says we can never demonstrate anything about matters of fact, about necessary connections in the cause. We always only learn it from experience. But of course, we couldn't have learned about this connection from experience. That would be circular, right? Because this connection is the one that says you can learn from experience. So we couldn't have demonstrated and we couldn't have learned from experience. And so we get the skeptical conclusion or the skeptical doubt. All right, then why should we believe anything about matters of fact beyond the immediate evidence of sense and memory? Right? Because they're all based on this connection here but this connection here is neither demonstrable nor can it be acquired empirically. Okay, now's a question. If Hume doesn't believe in that necessary connection, would he not agree with the logical train of thought that we base our experience off of the fact that the future will be like the past? Okay. Would he not agree with the logical train of thought that we base our experience off the fact that the future will be like the past? In other words, does he think we're making a mistake? I'm not sure I understand the question. I think maybe the question is, does Hume think, therefore, that we're making a mistake when we use this principle that the future will be like the past? So, the conclusion of section 4 is that it seems like we're making a mistake. Why should we believe this at all? That's why it's a skeptical conclusion or a skeptical doubt, right? The place we end up in is, so maybe we shouldn't believe any of this stuff, right? Anything that was based on this principle. But anything that was based on this principle is any belief in matters of fact beyond the immediate evidence of sense and memory. So that's practically everything we think we know about the world. And as I said before, like even when we say the immediate evidence of sense, just as in Berkeley's refutation of skepticism, like what we're allowed to believe there is actually not what we usually think is part of the immediate evidence of sense, right? So like we might think it's the immediate evidence of sense that there's a fire there. But if by fire you mean that it not only looks like a fire, but it will feel like a fire if you get closer to it also, that goes beyond the immediate evidence of sense. So the immediate evidence of sense is really something like what, even Descartes admits is somehow contained in the certainty of the cogito, right? That it seems like there's a fire. That's what we know for sure. And memory tells us that it seemed like there was a fire. Okay, I'm not sure. So section 5, that's called skeptical solution to these doubts, is going to explain. It's not exactly going to show that it's not a mistake. It's going to show that we can't regard it as a mistake because something does make us make this conclusion and we can't stop making it. Did that help answering the question? Okay. All right. So that's the end of section 4. Now I'm going to go on to the new material, unless there's other questions before I go on. Okay. So so this is the skeptical solution. Right? This is the conclusion of the whole matter. That is, this is the conclusion of section 5, the skeptical solution. A simple one, though it must be confessed pretty remote from the common theories of philosophy. The truth is, it's not that remote, really, from Locke or Berkeley. But okay, anyway. All belief of matter of fact or real existence is derived merely from some object present to the memory or senses and a customary conjunction between that and some other object. So, by customary conjunction, he means that we're used to thinking of A and B together. Right? That's the custom part. Custom or habit is the principle that leads us to this conclusion, which neither reason nor experience could establish. Right? Experience can't establish it because it's a precondition for experience that you have this principle, and reason can't establish it because reason can't establish necessary connections. So between matters of fact, right? Only necessary connection between ideas by the principle of contradiction. So this principle that the future will be like the past and all its individual instances are not based on reason or experience. They're based on custom or habit. So the customary conjunction means that we're in the habit of getting impressions A and B together. Right? Like we're in the habit of, it's customary, it's something that's happened over and over to us, that we've seen something that looked like a fire, and then if and when we were close enough to it, it felt hot. So when we see that visible impression again, even though reason doesn't allow an inference to the cause of A and from the cause of A to B, there's no such inference as this. And even though experience, and even, or I guess put it this way, even when you add experience into it, we still don't have a reason to believe it. Because, again, for experience to give us a reason to believe, to anticipate B, we would have to know this principle, which is itself one of the principles we're trying to account for. So, what does lead us to anticipate B? It's just we're in the habit of having the impressions of A and B go together. And so when we get the impression of A, even though the impression of B doesn't come, out of habit, we form the idea of B. Right? So this is an impression. And this is an idea. Right? Remember Hume's definition of impression versus idea. An impression is one of those strong, vivid contents of the mind that we normally think of as sensations or passions or whatever, whereas an idea is a fainter copy of that, which makes up what we normally think of as memory and imagination and so forth. Right? So in this case, we would call it imagination. We see the visible fire and we imagine. Of course, we don't just imagine it, we anticipate it. But we at least imagine, right? We can't anticipate it without imagining it. So we imagine the heat. We entertain the thought of the heat, even though we're not feeling it. That's what that means. So, so the basis of all of our beliefs in matters of fact, then, is always, number one, a present impression, or a remembered impression. That's a little bit weird, but anyway, a present impression or a remembered impression, and customary conjunction between impressions of that type and impressions of another type in the past. All our matters of fact are derived from that. All our, beliefs in, I guess for short I could call them remote matters of fact, right? Matters of fact that are not within the realm of our present experience or memory. So, right, so again, all belief of matter of fact or real existence is derived merely from some object present to the memory or senses, and a customary conjunction between that and some other object. So notice that, and this is why I said it's not really so remote from common philosophical theories, at least if you include Locke in common philosophical theories, because basically Locke almost agrees with this, right? Remember, when you asked Locke how we get our belief in real existence, he said, not by demonstration and not by intuition, but by sensible knowledge, meaning by the immediate evidence of sense. He didn't even include memory there. So this actually is pretty close to Locke. Locke agrees that if I believe anything is a matter of fact, and either about the external world or presumably about the operations of my own mind, if I believe anything is a matter of fact, that's always based on some present, what Hume would call an impression. And then somehow from that, I get to another idea. So the only difference really is this, the same consistent difference that we've seen between them already, namely that, again, Locke thinks that to some limited extent there are visible necessary connections between distinct ideas. So Locke thinks that to some limited extent I can actually demonstrate other matters of fact from the ones that are immediately present to the senses. Right? Like, so that if I feel that feeling, the simple idea of solidity, without having to have any previous experience of solidity, in order to form a customary connection between it and something else, I can see it's visibly necessary that the thing that's the cause of that idea will not allow my hands to come together while it remains in between them. So that's the kind of additional fact that Locke thinks, additional matter of fact that Locke thinks we can actually demonstrate based on our present sensations, whereas Hume says, no, there are no such visible connections. So each of them is consistent. That's a good sign, and in particular, it's a sign, like, if you think that Locke is just kind of blundering around, as some people do, this is a sign that that's not true, because, the different ways that Hume disagrees with Locke fit together, right? So they actually disagree about something. It's not just an oversight on Locke's part. Okay. So far, so good. Are there questions about that? Okay, so before I talk about I guess I would say about the details of the skeptical solution, like how skeptical is it, and what is it really supposed to show, which will this isn't a good place to write that. Section 5 has 2 parts. Section 6 is about probability. It's interesting, but I'm not really going to talk about it. And section 7, well, it also has 2 parts, but I'm not going to write that up. So this is the skeptical solution. Then there's a part about the nature of belief. That's part 2 of section 5, which he says, if you don't like really abstract reasonings, you can skip this. But whether you like abstract reasonings or not, I love them, so we're definitely not going to skip it. And then section 7 is about the idea of power. Now, I'm basically going to talk. I've already, given the punchline of section 5, part 1. But when I come to speak about it in detail, I'm going to mix it together with this because they're really about the same issues. This kind of necessary connection between things in the cause. Remember, I said that it was in this case that Locke said we could conclude that there's a real power in the object, right? So, I mean, in calling this into question, we're really also, the two things have to come up together. He splits them into 2 pieces, I think, to give you a kind of maybe a kind of stopping place where you think that this skeptical solution is going to be easier to take than it actually is. Let me put it that way. All right. So I'm going to talk about that after I talk about this part on belief. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, Hume's theory of belief. And the reason this is where he discusses his theory of belief is that, remember, so the thing is we have a present impression. And then, due to a customary conjunction, we get this idea. But as I pointed out, that's really, to say that we get the idea is really insufficient, right? It's not just that we imagine this fire being hot, we believe it's hot. So, in order to, so this isn't exactly what Hume says in the transition from part 1 to part 2. He kind of just says something like, oh, if we understand what belief is better, then maybe we can draw some analogies that will allow us to understand in some sense why there's this principle of customary conjunction yielding belief. But I think the truth is that without part 5, section 2, it's really not clear what this solution amounts to. That is, I guess Hume would say in his defense, well, everyone already knows what it is to believe. It's not like I have to explain that to you. So I'm just going to tell you as a matter of fact, and it is a matter of fact that we learned from experience. So in other words, this is another part of the answer to the question before. Like, does Hume think this is a mistake? Again, the answer is Hume thinks, in a sense, it's a mistake. It's not rational. But in another sense, it's not a mistake. We can't regard it as a mistake because we can't help doing it. And Hume doesn't try to stop doing it, right? So in the midst of this argument, Hume doesn't try to stop learning anything from experience. So as a matter of fact, Hume can say, when we've, had these impressions together before and we get one of them again, we tend to believe the idea of the other one, not just to imagine it. And he could just leave it at that and say, well, you know what it is to believe something, right? Okay, but still, it's going to make his account more satisfying if he can explain what is the difference between just having an idea and imagining the thing, right? Like fantasizing about heat, and believing that something is hot, even though you don't feel it now. So the question is, what is the difference between fiction and belief? Right? So what's the difference between imagining heat and belief in heat? And again, Hume takes it for granted. And is this obvious? It's possibly not obvious at all, but it's certainly something that Locke and Berkeley would both agree with, and Descartes also would agree with. So, so he takes for granted that this at least involves this, right? That is, in order to believe that something is hot, and assuming I'm not presently feeling its heat, I have to at least imagine it as hot. So the question is more particularly about the difference between this and this is, what does this have that this doesn't? Right? That is, what do I add, so to speak, to the mere idea of heat when I believe that something is hot? And what you might think I add to it is the idea of belief. Right? So you might think that the belief that a thing is hot equals the idea of heat plus the idea of belief. So, so that when I merely imagine something as hot, I have that thing, I have that idea of heat. But when I believe it's heat, I have that idea of heat, plus I have another idea. Now I'm calling it the idea of belief, but the truth is really, a better name for it might be the idea of real existence, which, remember, actually is something that Locke talks about. The idea of real existence. So, right, in order to make a belief that something is hot to the idea of heat, I add the idea of real existence, and now I have the idea of heat really existing. Oh, someone just asked, so you need the belief in heat in order to have the idea of heat. No, what I was saying is the other way around, right? That Hume and Locke and Berkeley agree. And there's nothing strange about this. It's just maybe if you think about it more, you'll say, well, it's not obvious. But Hume and Berkeley and Locke agree that in order to believe something is hot, I have to imagine heat and then somehow attribute it to the real object. Okay, right. And so again, the question is, what do I add to the idea of heat in order to make it into a belief in heat? And the answer that we're trying out here, which at least in some places seems to be Locke's answer, is that I add another idea to it, the idea of real existence. So Hume says that it couldn't be that. Right? Wherein, therefore, consists the difference between such a fiction and belief? It lies not merely in any particular idea which is annexed to such a conception as commands our assent. Right? A conception that commands our assent is the same thing as a belief in this context. Right? Like it's the conception of heat that we no longer, we don't just consider, but that we assent to being in the object. Right? That is, we judge that it is there, as opposed to denying it or suspending judgment. So it lies not merely in any peculiar idea which is annexed to such a conception as commands our assent, and which is wanting to every known fiction. To every known fiction means to everything that we know is a fiction. Right? So in other words, the theory that's being tried out here is the one that I just explained before. The theory that's being tried out is the theory that when we know it's a fiction, we just have the idea by itself, and that's how we know it's a fiction, because it doesn't have the idea of real existence connected to it. But as soon as we believe that it's true, right now, I mean, it might still be a fiction in the sense that we could be wrong. But as soon as we believe it's true, what happens is that we add this other idea of real existence or belief to it. That's the theory that's being tried out, but that Hume is going to reject, right? Because the beginning of the sentence is, it lies not merely in any peculiar idea, etc. Right? So the difference between just imagining something as hot, but knowing full well that, I mean, of course, not knowing that it isn't hot, but not knowing full well that there's no reason to think that it is, that you just made this up, right? So the difference between that, the known fiction, and the belief, where you assent to it. So you imagine it as hot, and you say, and it is. The difference can't be just some peculiar idea which is annexed to such a conception as commands our assent, but which is wanting to every known fiction. Why not? For as the mind has authority over all its ideas, it could voluntarily annex this particular idea to any fiction, and consequently be able to believe whatever it pleases, contrary to what we find by daily experience. Right? So what he's saying is that if the belief in heat were just a complex idea, composed of the idea of heat and some other idea, then the mind has the power to form complex ideas. Right? So we could ourselves just decide to put together the idea of heat with the idea of real existence, and then we would have the belief in heat. So we would believe that the thing is hot. We would be able to believe that the thing is hot just by wanting to believe it. And you understand, he's not talking about some kind of subterranean process of motivated reasoning or whatever, where, ultimately the reason we came to have this belief is because we wanted to believe it, and so we closed our eyes to this, that, and the other thing, or some kind of complicated, indirect thing like that. He's saying that just as if we have the idea of gold and the idea of mountain, we can imagine a golden mountain, so too, whenever we want, right? So too, if we have the idea of heat and the idea of real existence, we can, now you can call it imagining heat that really exists. But once the whole theory here is that once you add this idea of real existence to it, you're not just imagining it anymore. Now you believe in it, right? So just as I could imagine a golden mountain whenever I wanted, I could believe that a golden mountain exists whenever I wanted. Now, and he says, evidently, we can't do that. So, I mean, I guess there's two questions about this. One would be, how do we know we can't do that? And another would be, how do we know that we always can do that with any two ideas? Right? Because the argument has two parts. It says that number one, if we have two ideas, we can always join them. The mind has full authority over its ideas, or whatever he says. The imagination has command over all its ideas. So there's two steps. The imagination has command over all its ideas, but the imagination can't achieve belief at will. Therefore, we're not dealing with two ideas here, right? And that's the conclusion. So you might ask how we know either one of those, right? That is, how we know, on the one hand, that the imagination has command over all its ideas, and we also ask how we know, on the other hand, that we can't believe something just by wanting to. So the first question, I mean, all right, actually, let me put it this way. So in this passage, it sounds like the answer to the second question, how do we know that we can't believe something just by wanting to, is that it's contrary to what we find by daily experience. That is, it's just an empirical fact that we can't do this. I'm going to call that into question later, whether that's all the only basis Hume thinks there is for this. But as for the first one, he doesn't say how we know it here. And it's also kind of weird that he says we know it here, because later he seems to say that it, not only do we don't know it because it's not true, right? Our authority over our sentiments and passions is much weaker than that over our ideas. This is page 45 in section 7. And even the latter authority is circumscribed within very narrow boundaries. As a matter of fact, we can't just imagine whatever we want to all the time. Some things are hard to imagine. Some things are hard not to imagine, even though we don't want to imagine them, right? So it's just not true that we can always combine whatever ideas we want to, according as we will them combined or not. So, and that's what we know by experience, according to section 7. We know from experience that the mind's power over its ideas is not complete. So how to reconcile these two things? I mean, this is a typical question that you find reading a text like this, right? Like, I mean, this is the kind of thing that you want to notice and flag, right? Like, didn't he say the opposite before? Right. So And of course, the answer always could be, well, the answer could be, oops, he didn't notice he was saying the opposite. In this case, with something so important, with someone like Hume, that seems unlikely, right? It could be that he's telling you different stories in the different places because the assumptions in the two places are different, or because he thinks different readers will get to the other place, or all kinds of reasons. But most of the time, you at least hope or try to find a way that there isn't a contradiction. So, and to do that, you have to like try to re-understand what he's saying in at least one of the places so that they don't contradict each other. So in this case, I think the point must be that when he says that the mind always has authority over its ideas to separate and combine them, he means that when we consider anything as a peculiar idea, we're already exercising that authority. Right? So, in other words, if we could say, if we could know that there's another idea besides the idea of heat involved in this belief, then we're already abstracting. We're already separating the two. So we already know that there's nothing in principle to prevent us from taking them apart and putting them together with other ideas. Even though, and this is the kind of things he talks about in section 7, right now we may be too lazy or drowsy or frantic or whatever to actually do that. We already can see that there's nothing to prevent that happening in general because we've already seen that they're two different ideas. So in other words, this is basically just the same point over again, that there's no necessary connection between distinct ideas, I think. Right? That is the fact that the sense in which the mind has complete authority over its ideas is that if the mind can distinguish two ideas, then they really are distinct. And therefore, there's no necessity of them going together. And therefore, under the right circumstances, I could make them go together. So, but that makes the other question I was asking more difficult, right? So maybe I should write these questions here, right? How do we know the mind has command over all its ideas? And the second question was, how do we know we can't believe things at will? So the answer I just gave to the first question basically is, well, we know that, hold on a second, there's glare here. I'll be back in 1 second. So the answer is that we know that in the following weak sense, we know that there are no two ideas such that it's visibly impossible for the mind to separate them and combine them at will. But that means that makes this question harder, because then when we say that we can't do that with belief, we must mean that it is visibly impossible for us to cause ourselves to believe something just by willing it. Right? Because again, otherwise the two don't contradict each other. Maybe the reason I so far haven't been able to cause myself to believe something just by willing it is just because I was drowsy or lazy or, and so forth. So for this to show that we can't be dealing with two distinct ideas here, what we know here must be stronger than just that it hasn't happened so far, that it goes against our daily experience. So I think that now this you might think I've traded one contradiction in the text for another. This isn't a contradiction, but it does mean that Hume is being ironic in the technical sense that he didn't say everything he knows, right? All he said was this is contrary to our daily experience, but I believe he thinks it's evidently impossible. Why would it be evidently impossible to cause yourself to believe something by willing? I think the answer is that a state you could cause just by willing would not count as belief. Right? That is, it couldn't have the role in reasoning about truth and falsehood or about actions that belief has to have. If I could just change it at will, ever. A belief like that would necessarily be irrational because it's based on my whim. So I think that's what's going on here, although Hume doesn't say it. All right, so assuming that or something like that is right, so what we arrived at here is that this theory is wrong. The difference between fiction and belief is not that the belief adds another idea that the fiction didn't have, the known fiction. So, but it must add something to it because it's not true that every time you imagine something hot, you believe it's hot. So what does it add to? So it must add something that the mind doesn't have authority over. That's what we just argued. What does the mind not have authority over? Well, what Hume says actually is added in this place is, in this case, is a sentiment or feeling. But I take it that a sentiment or feeling is a type of impression. The mind doesn't have authority over impressions. Again, I think what this means is that impressions are necessarily simple, right? It's not really about activity and passivity, although it seems like it. But anyway, like to make this easier, you can think of it that way. And the way Berkeley and Locke think of it and Descartes think of it, an impression comes in against our will and we have to have it whether we want to or not. And certainly in other places where Hume uses the term sentiment or feeling, he does use it for a type of impression. Actually, this very passage that I just opened up to is one that caused me a little bit of trouble. Our authority over our sentiments and passions is much weaker. I wanted to say that we don't have any authority over our sentiments and passions. So I'm not sure exactly what to say about that, why he says that there. But anyway, I'm going to keep on assuming that in general, the weak authority we have over our sentiments and impressions is no authority at all. So, and that would, I mean, that it seems like that must be what Hume is assuming here, right? Because he says, just after he rejected the idea that belief is due to an extra idea, the thought that idea is, that belief is due to an extra peculiar idea, he says, it follows, therefore, that the difference between fiction and belief lies in some sentiment or feeling which is annexed to the latter, not to the former, and which depends not on the will, nor can be commanded at pleasure. Right? So as I was saying, what the argument before ruled out is anything that the mind has command over, in particular any idea. Therefore, if something is added here, it must be something the mind doesn't have command over. And Hume says, what does that have to be? It must be a sentiment or feeling. So I was saying that a sentiment or feeling is some kind of impression, but what kind of impression is it? And at in some places anyway, and I think this is what he's thinking here too, Hume equates sentiment with inward impression. Let's switch back to that. The mind feels no sentiment or inward impression from this suggestion of objects. I believe that or is what's known as epexegetical or, right? It's the or that you put between two things that are supposed to be synonymous, right? So you say like, I don't know, Homo sapiens or human beings are the kind of animals that blah, 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 right? Something like that. Okay, I don't know how I came up with that example. But, all right, so I take it that a sentiment is an inward impression. So, what this means then, this puts the conclusion of part 1 of section 5 in a new light, I think. That is, it already shows one of those analogies that Hume is on the lookout for here. Because it shows that that this conclusion is parallel to a later argument he's going to make against Locke in section 7. This is on page 42 in section 7. Mr. Locke, in his chapter of Power, says that finding from experience that there are several new productions in matter, and concluding that there must somewhere be a power capable of producing them, we arrive at last by this reasoning at the idea of power. But no reasoning can ever give us a new, original, simple idea, as this philosopher himself confesses. I don't know if that was readable because it was a little bit out of focus, but anyway, right, what he's saying there against Locke, so Locke says we get the idea of power because we see certain things succeeding each other over and over, and we get from that the idea that one of them had the power, or that at least something had the power to cause both of them, I guess is probably the right way to look at it. But Hume says, well, if power is really a simple idea, like you say it is, Locke, then we couldn't ever get it by inferring something. Simple ideas come only through sense or reflection, according to you yourself. Right? So, that same thing can be turned on the question, could we arrive at belief in matters of fact by reasoning? So, the reasoning in that case would have to produce not an idea, but an impression. And the first time we had that impression anyway, the reason would produce it from nothing. Which, as he just said, he and Locke agree we can't do. Right? So those are actually turn out to be parallel arguments. Okay, now I see I'm going to have to do some... All right, I'm just going to keep going. Because I would rather get to this part than the other part. Although I'm a little worried. All right, well, so the question, I guess, is, all right, it's some kind of impression. It's some kind of inward impression. Apparently an inward impression or sentiment or passion, according to Hume, and this is important, although it's also worrying, I think, for Hume, actually does have a kind of intrinsic reference to something else, right? That is, passion or a sentiment is always, like, if you take the usual examples like anger or joy or whatever, it's always anger at something. Or, like, I guess if you take the most fundamental ones, pain and pleasure, right? It's always some idea is painful, some idea is pleasurable. So the pain, although it's a simple idea, is somehow related to another idea as what it's about. And something like that must be the case here too, right? That is, if we say that it's just some impression that comes at the same time as the belief, as the idea, how could that amount to belief, assent to that idea? Right? Somehow this one must be is about this one. What strikes me is, right, what the impression that I get against my will is something about this. So what is it about this? Right? Like, what is the new impression I have in connection with my idea? And Hume says, well, I can't define it for you. You can't define sentiments or passions. Either you have them or you don't. But he says, I can describe it by analogy. And the analogy he gives is to, well, he gives actually a bunch of analogies, but the one I'm most interested in is that he compares it to a certain aspect of color perception. And it's that, so, I mean, colors can differ from each other or do differ from each other in various ways, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the color solid or three-dimensional representation of all the colors we can see, but basically, like, one way colors can differ from each other is in what's called hue, right? So that runs, it actually goes in a circle, right? Because purple goes back into red. But I'm just going to draw it as a line here. Right, so this direction is hue. Another direction is lightness, right? So you can have the same, see, there's no unambiguous words. I want to say the same shade of red, but that's exactly the problem is shade could mean all of these differences, right? But you could have the same, a red that lines up on the same place on this line, and another one, so they're like the same position between red and violet, but one of them is darker and the other one is lighter. I don't actually know how that dimension comes into here. I'm not going to talk about it more, lightness. But the one I am interested in is the one that's called saturation, or sometimes called chroma, which is that you can keep the same hue and lightness, but you can vary between a brilliant version of that, and then you can make it less and less colorful until you get down to some shade of gray that has no color at all. Right, so that's the difference in saturation or chroma. Now, I think the phenomenon of color vision that Hume is making his analogy to is this one, right? So that when he says that that the belief is, or what's special to belief is, so to speak, a more vivid impression of the idea. Or, I mean, I guess what he means is an impression that the idea is more vivid, I think is the right way to put it. Right? So the idea itself is more vivid, and the belief consists in the impression that the idea is more vivid. Right, so just like I can have an idea of heat and it goes along with the sentiment of pain, which is the impression that that degree of heat is unpleasant, so I can have this in the analogy case, I can have this idea of color and going along with an impression that that color is more bright in this sense of bright. It's farther from just being gray. It's more colorful. And similarly here, this impression is the impression that this belief is, so to speak, brighter, stronger, more vivid, and we're making an analogy to this. I mean, you could also think that he's saying something like this, that the idea goes along, and then there's another impression, which is a vivid impression that's with it or something. But I don't think that's what he can mean, because he says that it's this impression of vividness is what, or whether it's this impression, whatever it is, that accounts for the fact that belief plays a role in our practice and reasoning that mere fiction doesn't. Right? So in other words, the reason I'll avoid something that I believe to be very hot, but I won't avoid something that I merely imagine to be very hot for no reason, right? I have this pen here, and I just start imagining that it's very hot. No matter how hot I imagine it is, I'm never going to let go of it, so it won't burn me, right? But, well, say I can't hold a pen here without touching it, but pretend it's just, you can't see that I'm touching it, right? So now think of it this way. No matter how much I imagine it's hot, it's not going to stop me from touching it. Because I don't think it's hot. I just imagine it's hot. But as soon as I start to believe that it's hot, that's going to change all my actions with respect to it, right? I'm going to start being, well, I better go get an oven mitt to pick it up, whatever, right? So Hume says the reason belief has this role in our practice that mere imagination doesn't is because of this impression of vividness. So if this were just kind of like another impression that went next to it, far from giving this a stronger role, this impression would kind of distract us from it, I think, right? Like if at the same time I imagine something hot, I hear a bell ring, that's going to make that imagination of something hot have less role in all my thoughts, not more. So that's why I say this is the impression that this idea is vivid. This is going to be Hume's understanding. So I think we'll see how much I get to explaining this in detail, but just briefly, so Hume's understanding of how customary conjunction works then, according to this theory of belief, is that he says when an idea, so remember there's these three principles of association: contiguity, resemblance, and cause and effect. And he says whenever I have an idea, I think this answers a question I was asking last time. I'm not sure I asked it. Whenever I have an idea, I'm going to be likely to have other ideas that are connected to it by those three principles, right? So I imagine the Oakland Zoo, and therefore I imagine the parking lot because they're next to each other in space. I didn't see either one of them. But Hume says, however, if the association is not with an idea, but with an impression, right? So the filled-in circles are always impressions now, and the empty circles are always ideas. If it's with an impression, then this idea not only gets brought up by this principle of association, but it gets brought up with more vividness. It, so to speak, borrows some vividness from the impression. Right, so now if we imagine that I'm not just imagining the Oakland Zoo, but actually seeing it, Hume says it will suggest the idea of the parking lot with extra vividness. That example maybe is not that great, but he gives an example with resemblance. He says that a picture of my friend resembles my friend. So if I imagine a picture of my friend, this is the idea. If I imagine a picture of my friend, then I'm likely to imagine my friend. They're associated because they resemble each other. But he says, like, if my friend is absent, I'm not usually going to be interested in imagining the picture of my friend in order to get the idea of my friend associated by it. If I want to think of my friend, I'll just think about my friend. But, he says, now consider the case where, rather than imagining a picture of my friend, I can actually see a picture of my friend. So now, if I want to think about my friend, I'm going to be like, oh yeah, let me look at the picture. Why is that, Hume says? Well, it's because actually seeing the picture gives additional vividness to the idea that it resembles. So just imagining the picture gets me to imagine my friend, but no more strongly than I was imagining the picture. So it's not good for anything. But seeing the picture gets me to imagine my friend more strongly. And so if I want to think about my friend, I look at the picture. Right? So this is how Hume says constant conjunction works. I've seen A and B go together before, lots of times, and so they become associated by the principle of contiguity in time and space. Now, that means that if I imagine A, I'll tend to imagine B. Right? If I have the idea of A, I'll tend to have the idea of B. So if I imagine what looks like a fire, I'll imagine feeling heat. But of course, that doesn't make me believe that there's heat just because I imagined a fire. Why not? Well, this is just a special case of what we were talking about before. This association, because this one is merely an idea, it's merely imagined, it doesn't transfer any vividness to this one. And the impression of vividness is belief. There's no impression of vividness here, so I don't believe it. Whereas if I actually see a fire, now some of the vividness of seeing the fire gets transferred to the belief, to the idea of heat. Therefore, I believe that it's hot. Because, again, the belief that it's hot is just the impression of that increased vividness. Okay. I think I should stop and ask if there are questions. I've gone on for a long time now about the very chain of reasoning that Hume says if you don't really like abstruse reasoning, you might want to skip it. So are there questions about this? Perhaps not. Okay. So the question is, what should I talk about in the last 3 minutes? I wanted to talk about why I think it's saturation and not hue. And all I can say briefly is that if you remember back in section 2, when he said, oh, there is an exceptional case where I can get an idea. even though I've never had the corresponding impression. The exceptional case was where he said, I've seen every shade of blue except one. Now they line up all the different shades of blue and there's a gap. Don't we think I can fill it in? So I think by by shade of blue, he means hue, not saturation. And why do I think that? Just did I get rid of the... Why do I think that? Because we don't want to say, in this case, that the faint idea of B and the vivid idea of B are two distinct ideas. Right? Otherwise, the impression that this one is vivid would have nothing to do with this one. So we wouldn't have a contrast between imagining B and believing B. We would have a contrast between imagining B and believing something else. So that is, in order to make sense of this, and therefore he must think the same thing in the analogous case of colors, we have to think that the mind can vary the vividness of ideas once it's already got them in from impressions. I mean, it can't do it at will. But still, we don't need a new... I mean, you can see the same thing this way, too. The analogy is that the impression is the most vivid of all, and then the ideas that constitute belief, that are part of a belief, are more vivid, and then we get to the ones that are less vivid, right? So if you say every idea is the copy of an impression, you can't treat the more vivid and the less vivid one as two different impressions. Rather, you have to say, this is the impression, and this is the same impression, only fainter. Right? So similarly, in this case, I think Hume will say that when you get the idea of a certain shade of blue in the sense of hue, you can already imagine it being fainter or brighter without getting new ideas. And that's not an exception. So this seems to mean that Hume does think we know something about ideas that we didn't learn from experience, right? And this is important to pay attention to. Why? It's one of the principles that I think Kant believes that Hume doesn't notice that he's relying on, right? And the principle is that every idea has a degree of intensity, right? As we know that ideas come in degrees of intensity, and we don't have to learn that from experience. Okay, I haven't said anything about the idea of, almost anything about the idea of power, but it's already 2 minutes over, so I will stop here and see you next week.